Is there anything else I should? So the audio is okay. I'm using an external mic.
Yes, it's quite clear.
Good.
Yes, very good. All right,
Okay.
we are expecting quite a lot of people, Peter, so we'll probably give them a little bit of time to join. And I can see already that we've got some international guests, which is very nice.
Oh. That beams around the world. Yeah, so yes. You guys use Teams now, do you?
Yes, yes. Yeah. We are unfortunately restricted in the number of teleconferencing platforms that we're allowed to use, and Zoom just does not seem to work very well within our firewall. So Teams is about our best option these days.
Well, okay. Yeah, I must say Zoom is so smooth now as opposed to a year ago when it was starting up. So yeah, it's been absolutely excellent. Great. So that's good. I'm sorry about all your COVID news, guys. But you're exactly the same as BC at the moment.
Oh, yes, you're saying that, Peter. So you're having a fourth wave, is that it? We're
having a fourth wave. It's not quite at the level of our highest wave. I can't remember whether that was the second or the third. But you know, it's a funny. For us, we've had a fantastically hot June, July, and August, and I think the population is so fatigued, and the government have kind of dropped all their kind of perspective and requirements in terms of, so the government aren't pushing any kind of measures. The population's kind of breathing a sigh of relief, even though obviously we're just about to go into cooler weather, school and uni back, and all that kind of our phase of turn of the year. And actually all the institutions and organizations and companies are bringing in measures like mandatory vaccinations and masks must be worn. The government's kind of saying, oh, we don't want to discriminate. So we kind of flipped around from the government, both provincial and federal, trying to push things on the population. So now we've got three groups. We've got sort of the organized groups, people running shops or running hospitals or businesses and banks are all saying, no, we're just going to bring in everything and make it all required and mandatory. And the government's still kind of trying to waffle around and say, well, we really don't want you to bring in mandatory this and mandatory that. So it's actually a fascinating dialogue going on.
Yes, I think that's, from what I understand, in some European countries, they've got these sort of sanitary passes. I think in France that's been brought in, and there are, of course, people that are against that. So, yeah, it's very interesting to see the different approaches that different countries are taking.
Yeah. I'm just a fan of make everything mandatory, but make relatively simple mechanisms for people to opt out with a reasonable basis and argument. And I think you'll end up with 95% following the mandatory that way, is my feeling. But it's that's just a uni view.
Yes, indeed. Well, look, we're getting good numbers of people joining us, but we'll hold out for a couple of minutes and then I'll start your introduction, Peter. So, yeah, what we usually do is we usually ask people to add their questions to the chat, particularly when we've got lots of people online, and then usually I'll ask questions on behalf. I'll just read questions from the chat as we go. It can be a little bit hard to keep track of people if they've got their hands up, when people actually put their hands up. So I think the chat allows me to ask questions in the order that they arrive. And if two people have asked the same thing, then I'll just ask at once, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah. And obviously I can't see a chat line here the way my screen works.
Right. So. Okay. Yeah. No. But that's probably a good thing, really. You don't really want to be. I find that a bit distracting if I'm talking. Well, look, I think we will start, and so I'd just like to obviously thank everybody who's joined us today here for the Statewide Biobanks Seminar Series. Today we are very excited to have an international speaker who I think will be known to many people who are joining us today, and that's Professor Peter Watson. So Peter Watson, he is a staff pathologist and senior scientist at BC Cancer in Vancouver, Canada. He's Professor of Pathology at the University of British Columbia, and he's also an adjunct professor at the University of Victoria. And many people here today will know that Peter has been involved in developing biobanks and improving the way that biobanking is carried out in the human health sector for 30 years. So he's currently the Director of Biobanking and Biospecimen Research Services at BC Cancer, and he also co-leads the Canadian Tissue Repository Network, also known as CEDARNet, that maintains and operates a Biobank Resource Centre and the CEDARNet Biobank Certification Program that is accessible nationally and internationally. And some of you may be aware that the Biobank Certification Program that is running in New South Wales is based upon the CEDARNet Biobank Certification Program and supported by that program. Peter also maintains an active clinical pathology practice and a research laboratory program that is focused on the molecular pathology and biomarkers of progression and response to treatment in breast cancer. He's authored over 200 research papers, and these include papers on biobank classification, standards, sustainability, and also biobank utilisation. So today, Peter is going to be talking about a topic that I think is interesting to many of us, and that is about how many biobanks actually exist, why we should count them, who cares about this, and why it matters. So Peter, wonderful to welcome you to the Biobank, and we're really looking forward to your seminar. Thank you.
Great. Well, hello, everybody. I can't see the table, but I know you're all out there, and thanks very much for the intro, Jenny. Okay, so as you can see from the title, and you heard the title, is that this talk's going to revolve really around a whole series of questions. And the purpose of the questions is really to get at the central questions which aren't on this title slide, which is the question of where do we actually stand with respect to supply and demand of human biospecimens to support health research. And so that's really the focus of the whole talk. But I'm going to begin with these sort of initial questions around how many biobanks are there. So before we get too far into it, just in case there's some folks around the table that are new to biobanking, I'm just going to start off with a very brief definition. So this is my definition of biobanks and applies in this talk. So biobanks that we're talking about, even though there's a whole range of types of biobanks across the scientific spectrum, what we're talking about today is health research biobanks, so academic biobanks supporting health research towards the goals of precision medicine. So most of those biobanks are holding human biospecimens to support that research. And so biobanks, in my mind, are entities that either coordinate or actually arise, so that's the biospecimen collection, arise out of an activity of biobanking. And so we're talking about all forms of research collection, from a couple of samples in a researcher's lab all the way to a large professional biobank or a cohort study that's enrolled many participants and created a biobank in association with that cohort. And of course, those many forms can be described in different ways and classifications. There's, well, classification that I favor at the bottom around, structured around the defined use and the purpose of the biobank. But in this talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about small, medium, and large biobanks that approximate mono and oligo and polyuser biobanks. But that's a little bit of a digression. So the point I'm making is we're talking about all forms of research collection that are stored somewhere in health research for the purpose of supporting future research. So let's just start with the first question. How many biobanks are there? So why count? Why count biobanks? Well, I think the real reason to count biobanks is it's a unit of measure. It's a measurable thing that you can pull together and creates a foundation for these other important questions that we should and want to ask. And of course, what are those questions? Well, they could be questions like who's running these biobanks, who's governing them, where are they? But in this talk, what we're going to talk about is how many biospecimens are stored in their inventories and how many of these biospecimens are actually being used now. So if that's why we count, who cares? Well, to my mind, there's at least 4 sets of stakeholders in health research biobanks who really should care about this initial question and the ones that follow. So researchers should care because every time they submit a grant application and propose collecting a new set of specimens, they want to be original, they want to be innovative, and they want to be competitive. So individual researchers should want to know the answer of where are other biobanks and are they proposing to collect another set of specimens that already exist. REBs should want to know the same thing for a very similar reason. I mean, REBs, that's research ethics boards in Canadian language, should want to know, what is the rationale behind asking another set of participants to generously donate biospecimens and data in support of health research. So that's why ethics boards should want to know the answers to these questions. Funders, we'd hope, would really want to know the answers to these questions in order to develop and deploy strategy around where to deploy valuable funds. How do we keep the research engine going? Well, we need to be strategic about what we fund, how much we fund, and where we fund it. And biobanking is just one widget within the whole sort of research ecosphere. So funders should really want to know, what are they spending on biobanks? Is it enough? Is it too little? Or what do they do about it? And of course, biobankers themselves should want to know the answers to these questions. So they want to be relevant, they want to be responsible, and they want to be sustainable. So I think all those stakeholders should want to know the answers to these subsequent questions. How many are stored in inventories, how many biospecimens are actually being used now. But ultimately, what does it matter to all of these stakeholders? Well, I've given you individual reasons for different stakeholders, but I think collectively, everybody around this table and everybody listed under these different stakeholders really should want to know the answer to the 4th question, which is, do we have enough biospecimens to meet research demand? Because we're all interested in research continuing effectively and in reaching its end goals. So we all have a stake in that 4th question. Okay, so now let's begin with the first question. How many biobanks are there? Because the answer to this allows us to move on to the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, and subsequent questions. So you'd think that there'd be a lot of information out there to answer the question. And you'd think that most of these stakeholders, like the ethics boards and institutions and funders, would be tracking human biospecimen research use and where they are and what we're doing, just as we do with animal research. But the fact of the matter is that very few people have any knowledge or idea about how to answer this question. And I certainly know that in Canada because most of these stakeholders keep calling and asking me this question. And it got to a point just under a year ago that I thought, well, maybe we should try and tackle the question a little bit more systematically than the back of an envelope. So that's really the sort of the basis and the impetus behind this talk, was the fact that I'm being asked how many biobanks are there, and I don't think any of us really know. So I think it's a good question. So how do you answer it? Well, others have tried before using online sources, and there's some literature, a little bit of a literature you can find, but it's pretty spotty, and it's not that it's not really very informative. But I think what's changed is we now have, over this last decade, 4 informative locators have emerged that give us some kind of tool to address this question. So what do I mean by informative? Well, of course, these aren't the only biobank locators around, but what I mean by informative is that all of these locators are relatively large relative to the region that they cover. They're all relatively well established. They've all been in operation for 5 to 10 years. And importantly, they all cover a defined geographic region. So there are some other locators out there that don't have any real geographic determinants, but these do, or at least compartments within the locators, such as the CETANET locator, which is international, but we have a Canadian compartment that we can analyze. And then the fourth and final reason why I say informative, and it's very important, is all these locators have, to some degree, some positive pressures have been developed or emerged over the years to drive biobanks within these geographic regions to sign up and list within these locators. So for our purposes for this question, these four locators provide a tool to try and answer the question. So now imagine yourself in northern Canada in winter, you're in the middle of February and you're locked down by COVID. So what better to do than to spend time trawling through these four locators to answer this question? So that's what I did in my February. And here you see some of the results of this analysis. You see a tabular results of analyzing four different locators. And you can see it's sort of structured in columns by the locator, the country and region, number of biobanks, and then it's sorted by GDP. And then before we talk anymore, recognize that these different rows are also filtered. The BBMRI results are filtered by the top 10 countries by GDP. And that's partly to try and make some uniformity or conformity with the CNET and the New South Wales locators. And finally, as you can see, several of the results from the locators, the Canadian, the Australian, and the UK components are also filtered by large biobanks. In other words, using a BBMRI developed definition, biobanks with more than 1,000 biospecimens. And so now if you cast your eye to the final column, the one which is biobanks per million, you can actually calculate the number of biobanks that are present in a population, in a set of regions and countries that have a relatively comparable GDP, relatively comparable and high, and I would say all of them with a relatively healthy and vibrant health research arena. And so on the right-hand column, you can see that the number of biobanks per million population in these different countries ranges from 0.5 in Germany to 12 in Sweden, but the average is 2. So that's our first observation. The second sort of question around these locators is, well, that's the large biobanks. How many smaller or medium-sized biobanks are there? So this table shows a little bit of the results from trying to tease this out, but it's not very satisfactory. Firstly, as you can see, this is the same table with the same kind of columns, but you're looking at the UK medium small biobanks, the Canadian ones, and small medium biobanks in New South Wales. And you can see that the proportions, or even though the large biobank stats in these three locators for these three regions, UK, Canada, and New South Wales, are all actually identical. They're all 2 biobanks per million with the large biobanks, but the medium small biobanks range from 1.5 to 7.1. And I think all of these estimates are vast underestimates. And I think it relates to the pressures and the encouragement and the incentives for smaller collections to be enrolled in these locators. But from personal experience and also from looking through the records of applications for ethics approval for human research in UBC in the year of 2019, it's clear to me that the ratio of small and medium-sized research collections to large biobanks is certainly 10 to 1, and it's probably a lot larger. So here at the bottom, you can see I've sort of jumped over this table and made my own conclusion that in these kind of relatively affluent, high GDP, strong, vibrant health research regions, the conclusion is that there's probably 2 large biobanks and 20 small to medium biobanks at least. That's a conservative estimate. So 22 biobanks per million population. So we've answered the first question. So let's move on to the second one. So if you've got 22 biobanks per million population, how many biospecimens are stored in those inventories? Well, this is also a challenging question, but first, before we tackle it, let's just remind ourselves what sort of biospecimens are we talking about? Well, to my mind, there's two types of biospecimens that are prevalent in health research. There's tissue biospecimens and there's blood biospecimens. Tissue specimens come in three flavors: fresh, frozen, and fixed, or formalin fixed paraffin embedded, in other words, FFPE. And blood specimens tend to come in two flavors: fresh and frozen. Now, the fresh flavored specimens, tissue and blood, really arise and make their way from patients to health research through a process of prospective biobanking. So they're fresh, they're collected, many of them are immediately consumed. Yes, some of them might make their way into inventories and become preserved in different ways, principally frozen, but the fresh specimens involve prospective biobanking. Similarly, the fixed specimens mostly come from clinical pathology archives across the Western world. So that's the source. Whereas frozen specimens, frozen blood and frozen tissue specimens, tend to involve biobank inventories. So we're really today talking about how many of these biobank inventory biospecimens, the frozen blood and the frozen tissue, are used in health research. But there's, of course, another factor. There's been an evolution over the years. So the previous slide I showed you was sort of my impression of 1990 when I was there. Now my impression in 2020 is that that proportion of biospecimens being used, in other words, the demand for access to frozen biospecimens in biobank inventories, has really diminished over these past few decades. And it's diminished because there's an relative increase in the demand for fresh specimens and for access to pathology archives, which of course biobanks are an important player and stakeholder and have capabilities to really help perform or help negotiate that process. But we're really, again, talking about these biobank inventories. So it's this impression that I've also had, as well as the questions around how many biobanks, that's really driven my interest in what you're hearing today. So I've already said, and one can imagine, that it's a challenging question to find how many biospecimens in those biobank inventories are actually being used. And of course, we could go and ask all the biobanks, but as we've said, there's already a challenge in finding where those biobanks and communicating with them. But even if we could do that very simply and easily, the second issue is that there are different types of biobanks. They have different operational designs and different sort of mechanisms of operation. So it's very hard to compare utilization rates across different biobanks for those reasons. So I think it's a much better approach to actually sort of think about first the numbers of biospecimens inventories within a region where you're familiar with it, and then move on to try and understand what is the output in that region in terms of research output using biospecimens. So here in this slide, we're looking at my impression of BC. And of course, I've been in British Columbia for 15 years. I'm very familiar with the biobanking landscape here. And so here, what I've shown you in the top part of this table is 5 of the larger biobanks. There are other large biobanks, but I've selected 5 here for the purposes of this analysis. And you can see the biobanks range in terms of large blood biobanks, large tissue biobanks, biobanks that support general areas of health research and ones that are focused on particular areas of health research. And here you can see listed the number of cases and number of samples in their inventories. In the bottom half of the table, you can see I've averaged this all up. So you can see that in British Columbia, large biobanks on average have 77,000 samples. And if you think that there's 2 large biobanks per million population, which is our conclusion from the previous question, then you can amplify that and say, well, in a region similar to British Columbia, large biobanks would probably hold about 155 or 154,000 biospecimens per million population that's supporting that research. And you can do the same math with medium and small biobanks, assuming there's about 20 and they have average of 500 biosamples per biobank. And so you can add another 10,000 to that. And so now you can reach a conclusion. At the bottom, the conclusion for this question is that the biobank inventories typically, I believe, hold about 160,000 frozen biospecimens per million population, supporting those biobanks and the research that surrounds them. So now we can get to the third question. So the third question is, how many of these biospecimens are actually being used now? And I was just speaking about this a moment ago, in that we can go to the biobanks, but I think it's very hard to cobble together the information we get direct from biobanks. So it's, I think, much more effective to go and look at the literature and look at how many biospecimens are being used in the research results that are generated and published in the literature. But to do that, we have to answer a number of additional questions. We have to know the number of researchers in a region. We have to know the number of biospecimen papers that each researcher generates per year. We have to know the number of biospecimens in a typical paper. And finally, we have to know the proportion of those that are coming from biobank inventories, as opposed to fresh biospecimens or pathology archives. So I think the answers to the first two questions are actually quite straightforward, at least for me here in Canada. And the first question, the number of researchers, is readily answered by our national research, health research funding body, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which has already done the analysis and says that there are 13,000 academic health researchers in Canada. So that works out at 340 per million population. So in BC, with 5 million population, we would have something like 1,700 researchers in BC. The answer to the second question, which is how many papers per year do those researchers generate that have biospecimens, is also quite straightforward to answer, because we actually did a study a few years ago, and we published this in Biopreservation, where we looked at the importance of biobanking in cancer research. And to address the questions in that paper, we looked at the output of a defined cohort of 35 investigators funded by one national cancer research funder, the Cancer Research Society. And this cohort of 35 were funded by grants submitted in 2010. And we followed their publications and analyzed this cohort for the next 4 years of their research output. And to cut a long story short, they generated a lot of publications, but 750 of those were papers with primary data, and 450 of that 749 were papers, about 450 were papers with primary data, sorry, and the total generation output was 750. And within that 450 data papers, 38% had human biospecimens were used to generate at least one data point. So we have the answer, is that at least a cohort of cancer researchers across Canada generate about 1.2 biospecimen papers per year. Now, of course, I hear you say 35 investigators is a pretty small cohort size to do an analysis, even though we looked at a lot of papers coming out. But I draw your attention to the right hand of the slide, where you can see that we also looked at the kinds of research that these 35 investigators were involved in across a coding schema used by cancer research funders in Canada. And as you can see, the profile in this kite graph of the cohort funded by the Cancer Research Society is compared with the similar kite graph profile of all cancer researchers funded at that time by all the other cancer research funders in Canada. And you can see that the pattern and profile of cancer research conducted by those 35 was actually pretty representative of the overall profile across Canada. So a small cohort, but fairly representative. So now we can move on to those last two questions to get at the question of the numbers in inventories, or how many are being used. We also need to know the number of biospecimens in a typical paper, and we then need to know the proportion coming from frozen samples coming from biobank inventories. So we published several papers over the years around biospecimen use, but I think the most useful data to draw on is a very recent publication that's now in press in biopreservation, where we actually conducted a study looking across the spectrum of health research, so not limited to cancer research. And we wanted to understand the changes in biospecimen complexity, that type of quality of biospecimen being used between 2000 and 2020. But in the process, we also looked at the sources of those biospecimens. In other words, the collection pathways used by researchers to obtain those different types of biospecimens. And so in that paper, we also have generated data that helps us answer the questions today. So we also noted from that paper that across health research, that approximately, well, in 2000, you can see just less than 100 biospecimens was the average number in a typical paper. Whereas by 2020, the average number of biospecimens used per paper across all health research is just over 200. And also more importantly, we're able to look at the proportion coming from retrospective collections in biobanks, in other words, frozen tissue collections and blood collections within biobank inventories. And you can see on the top part of the graph, if you just focus on the red and the orange part segments of the pie, don't worry about the other pathways. The red and the orange denote the retrospective and the prospective cohorts coming from biobanks. So by 2020, you can see that approximately 18% of cohorts were coming from biobanks, and 14% of those were retrospective cohorts, most likely frozen biospecimens coming out of inventories. So we take all of those numbers that I've just described, the number of researchers in a region, 350 per million population, 1.2 papers generated per researcher per year, the average number of biospecimens in a typical paper containing human biospecimens, and the percentage of those biospecimens coming from biobank inventories. You put it into the formula at the bottom, and you arrive at the answer of approximately 12,000 biospecimens per year per million population. That's our ultimate denominator. Biospecimens are being used and drawn from biobank inventories. So now we're ready to almost answer the question, do we have enough biospecimens to meet research demand? The answer is the current supply of approximately 160,000 biospecimens per million population, and the current demand is approximately 12,000 per year. So that ratio is quite a lot more than 10 to 1 of supply versus demand. But of course, I hear you say, and in the back of my mind is always Doug Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, saying the real question, the ultimate question, the answer to the life, the universe, and everything isn't what is current supply and demand, is what is future demand. Do we have enough specimens to meet future demand? So, of course, that is the big question that we need to address. So before getting at that, let's just stop and think for a moment. How precise are our current estimates around supply and demand? And then we'll just ask, what are the things we need to think about when talking about projections? Well, thinking about precision, the precision of the stored specimens depends very much on the definition of a biobank and the definition of a biospecimen unit. How big is a biospecimen? Whereas the use of biospecimens is also dependent on that definition of a biospecimen unit, but also very dependent on the definition of who's a researcher. What are the researchers we're talking about? So those are the kind of dependencies that I see around our two estimates. So if we just look at the stored biospecimens, our supply side, surprisingly and interestingly, our estimate of 160,000 biospecimens per million population stored in biobanks is actually very consistent with what you can extract from a publication from the BBMRI a couple of years ago, where they estimated they had 550 biobanks containing 60 million samples across 450 million in the EU. And if you do the math, that works out to 130,000 biospecimens per million population. And that's not counting medium and small size biobanks. So our estimate using some of the data that I presented to you is actually very similar to a back of the envelope calculation you can do from Europe. On the demand side, we still have the same issues of dependency on a biospecimen unit and how big is a biospecimen. But really, the demand size number is mostly driven by the definition of a researcher. And that number from CIHR saying that on average across Canada, we have 350 researchers per million population. So how can I validate that? Well, I thought long and hard about what did the landscape look like in BC. And actually, if you look at the published numbers for health researchers in Faculty of Health Research Sciences in our biggest university in British Columbia, and add a small number representing some of the smaller universities with health research portfolios, you actually end up with a number of approximately 150 academic faculty per million in BC, plus 2,000 clinical faculty per million. And I bet you that given the sort of the different ability of clinical faculty to generate the same kind of output as full-time academic faculty, that probably there's about 10% of that clinical faculty, about 200, are generating similar kinds of output. In other words, 150 plus 200 equals 350 researchers per million population, generating significant contributions to that proportion of papers published per year. So actually, I feel pretty confident in those two estimates. They won't be exact, but they're fairly close and can be validated. But what about projections? Well, projections are something else. Projections are based on looking at the future. And of course, you've got to take into account a lot of factors and variables, and it's a difficult thing to do. So on the supply side, inventories will always expand. And on the usage side, cohort sizes will always continue to increase. And I've humbly called those two statements together Watson's law to sort of align myself with Moore's law, which many of you will be familiar with, around the sort of change in semiconductor density. But the other two factors here are on the storage side, there's often only partial use of biospecimens, which will drive increased in inventory numbers unless we cull them and trim them. Prospective studies will always continue, and many of them will add additional samples to inventories once they've been used. And we actually need to collect and store for many years a lot of samples before they reach maturation of their data in terms of the outcomes data. So there's several drivers why inventories are expanding. On the the demand side, obviously analytical capacities are increasing. Selection requirements are growing, so we're always being asked for not just 100 breast cases, but 100 triple negative cases. So you have to have a wide inventory to handle specific selection requirements. And of course, it's also being moderated, that drive towards increased cohort size, by the growing use of existing digital data from existing research. So that serves to, if you like, dampen the increase in cohort size. But ultimately, to answer the question, what we need is a great debate. We actually have to pull together the community, think about it, stimulate people to debate it, and figure out what are all the perspectives, what are all the factors, and we really should turn our minds to the question of, do we have enough specimens to meet future demand? And for those of you who aren't steeped in English history, here I've depicted the previous great debate. That was, of course, the great debate in 1860 between the creationists and the evolutionists. In this context that I'm proposing, the creationists are those who believe in continued collection, keeping, and expanding, versus those who have evolutionary thinking. And of course, the original great debate was held in this building, the Pitt River Museum in Oxford, in the mezzanine on the second floor. And when you go into the museum, you'll find recognition of this debate, which of course was held between the current Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, and a leading biologist of the time, Thomas Huxley. But behind the scenes, the real players depicted here were Richard Owen on the left, and of course Charles Darwin on the right. And Richard Owen we have some connections with way back in my own family lineage. And of course, he's famous for having discovered the moa and having coined the word dinosaur. And he was a real proponent of the creationist theory as a result of his scientific work. And he was the coach behind Samuel Wilberforce. And of course, Darwin was the coach and mentor behind the positions put by Thomas Huxley. So that was the previous great debate. And I think we need to move ahead to a great debate in the biobanking and research world around human biospecimens. But of course, debates take a lot of time to stimulate and organize, and they don't always arrive at a clear answer. So for now, I've got to say that I myself believe that we have too many biospecimens in inventories. And at the same time, I think demand for those inventories is really waning. I don't mean demand for human biospecimens from biobanks. I mean demand from our inventories and our stocks. But I think it's really, if this is all true, it's urgent for biobanks to actually think and adjust before they actually go the way of the moa. So what can biobanks do to adjust? Well, in just the last few slides, I'll just summarize this in that I think biobanks need to think about three things. They need to think about promoting their current expertise and services rather than just their inventories. And of course, many biobanks have done that, including ourselves, partly by rebranding ourselves to convey that we're a biospecimen service rather than a biobank. The second thing that biobanks should do is they should stimulate use of the current inventories. And of course, this is another way to get them better used, because some of that shrink in demand is partly because researchers don't know where they are and they don't know how to find them. And of course, I hear you say, well, the biobanking community, including ourselves, and I know in New South Wales, have put a lot of thought and energy into trying to make biospecimens in our biobanks more visible and accessible. And a major tool has been development of online locators, which we've already used earlier in this talk. But the truth of the matter is that locators haven't really solved the problem. Locators have only gone a little bit of the way to satisfying demand from researchers. And I think the reason is partly contained in this publication from Phil Quinlan's group, published in Bio in 2020. And I think we'll also see some very interesting data soon to be published by Amanda Rush and you folks from New South Wales, telling us that actually locators don't actually improve the use of biospecimens inventories. And most researchers, as shown in the Quinlan group paper, actually obtain their biospecimens from local sources. In fact, 75% of 200 researchers studied across the UK mostly obtain their biospecimens through self-collection, collaborators, local biobanks, etc. And they also noted, rather interestingly, that the drivers to go local were the need to be able to link those biospecimens with clinical data, presumably in the research labs rather than in the biobanks, because the biobanks weren't able to supply that. But it's also a question of a desire for quality and help with the process. Now, there are a lot of concepts that under the surface around what quality and help were felt to mean in those user group sessions, but ultimately, the researchers were looking for advice and support and reputation from the biobank. What they weren't looking for was standards and certification and accreditation, rather interestingly. So I think this concept that researchers are going local and they're really wanting advice and support around a complicated process, as well as linked clinical data, are very important things to absorb. And so we thought about this ourselves on a parallel track over the last few years. How can we make better use of our inventories? And we clearly weren't doing it through our locators. And we began to think, well, locators aren't really answering the main questions that a researcher has. A researcher doesn't suddenly pop up and say, oh, I need to find a locator. What they actually do is they design their studies, they decide what they want to do in their project and their labs, and then they try and figure out what are the kind of biospecimens they need and where should they obtain them. And many of them do and many of them don't understand that there's a lot of determinants around selecting the right biospecimens for a particular study and a particular research question. And they don't fully appreciate that there's actually 3 different ways you can obtain those biospecimens. You can locate them, existing specimens in biobanks. You can go and collect them yourself, create your own biobank, or you can contract with a biobank to do it all for you. And so what we realized is locators are only one piece of this puzzle. What we needed to do was fill out the black box that sits ahead of locators. So what we've been working on and now created, and it's the first version has now gone live, is a platform to help researchers actually navigate the decision before they figure out which is the best option. One of those options might be to use a locator, but the other options are quite different. And so we've created this platform called the Biospecimen Navigator platform, and it's now live and online. You can go to it. It's really divided into 3 sections, which provide education and information around the 3 major ways that a researcher can obtain biospecimens. And if the researcher's keen and interested, they can also use a tool that we've embedded in the program, the decision tool, where we present the user with a short form or a long form containing 5 or 20 questions, which tease out the real determinants of which is the best option for a particular research study. And the answers to these questions feed into an algorithm in the website, and it spits out for the researcher the optimal choice for them to obtain their biospecimens, and then leads them, in this case, to contracting with a biobank. And in that section, it tells you what do you need to do, what's involved, where do you find tools and templates, and become educated about contracting with a biobank. So we think that's an important way to make locators more useful by putting them into context. But the very last thing I want to say is I think biobanks also need to adjust by rationalizing their stocks. We actually, as well as getting our inventories used more, we actually need to pay some attention to the fact that our inventories are gradually increasing, they're swelling, we're buying more freezers, and at some point, like true scientists, we actually have to make a decision. We have to actually rationalize and reduce the size of our inventories. And I think the problem has been that we haven't addressed this as biobankers. And because the reasons are obvious, there's a lot of aspects to consider. There are a lot of variables you need to combine. The variables are very hard to quantitate, so it's a tough decision. And we make it even tougher by, in the past, I think people have approached this by trying to arrive at an absolute value for a collection and then saying, should we destroy it or should we keep it? So what we've done is we've done a lot of thinking about this, and we think there's a framework or a better way that we could approach this decision. Obviously, the decision to keep or destroy a collection of biospecimens involve 3 areas of, or 3 main aspects that we need to consider. You have to consider the donor parameters, the ethics, the consent, the legal issues around a biospecimen collection. You have to consider the operational issues. How much storage have you got? Have you got the money to go on storing it? Do you have the freezers and the space? But I think the place where we've continued to get stuck and hung up is around collection features. What are the features of the specimens, their qualities, and the data? So I think that's the area that we could really get at. So what we've thought about is that we can structure all of those features of a collection into 4 different areas. We can bin them into integrity, quality, prospects, and scarcity. And each of the features within those 4 categories can be either assessed by a simple audit, measured by from looking hard at the samples and the data. You can look at prospects by soliciting research interest and evaluation of specific clinical relevance. And of course, scarceness, you can also examine through expert opinion and consideration of uniqueness and other parameters. So what we have then done is gone on and fleshed out those 4 bins around specimen features, and we fleshed out 3 or 5 subcategories to each, which we think are very important and distinct. And we structured it into a schema and applied a process, or proposed a process, whereby integrity, which is more the visual inspection of specimens and data, and very fundamental aspects about the organization of samples and data, can be answered in a binary fashion. It's a yes, no. You either proceed or you don't. But those other factors, all are qualitative. They're all opinion-based, just like peer review and grant funding and the way we make decisions in the rest of research. But I think by structuring the different elements and organizing them into these bins, and then trying to apply a qualitative score for each of these factors, you can end up with a quality score for a whole biospecimen collection, which in this schema, a collection will have a score from 15 to 75. But I hear you say that's still kind of sort of shooting in the wind. It's kind of just making up numbers and qualities. But I think the third part of the schema is important. The third part of the schema is this should always be done by comparing your primary collection with one or more comparator collections. It should always be a comparison value between collections, ideally within sub-collections within your biobank or collections you're well knowledgeable about close by. So you should always be subjectively and opinion-based comparing these parameters between your primary collection and your comparator collection or several comparator collections, and coming up with a relative value for each comparison, which can range from, when you arrive at a relative value, you either have a very small number, which would advocate destroy, or a very big number, which would advocate for keeping your primary collection. So very finally, clearly, that decision about keeping and destroying, again, it's a decision that needs the governance of the collection, in other words, the biobank and the leadership, to think very hard about donor issues or operational issues. But we think by approaching the collection features in this way and arriving at relative value scores, that you can actually summarize in a neat way the comparative value of different collections. And then you can either move forward to actually make a decision to discard a collection, as we've begun to do, or if you really just don't have the stomach and the heart to do that, at least by going through this process, you have a ranking of values associated with collections in your inventory for when your power goes down. And now you have assigned relative values for what to save first. Okay, so I think that's my run through the story of how are we doing with biospecimen supply and demand, and what do we do if we think, as I do, that we actually need to begin to tackle this issue of we've got too many specimens in inventory, falling demand for them, and we're going to need the space in our freezers for these valuable prospective collections of fresh samples that turn into frozen specimens and other types of new and modern specimens. So with that, as you can see, I want to give a shout out, obviously, to the partners, funders, and supporters of the work that we've done in this biospecimen biobanking research space, and many of the current and past funders of our different platforms. So thanks very much, and I'll hand the mic back to you, Jenny.
Peter, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Yeah, very, very thought-provoking. I'm going to go straight to the chat because I can see a question here from Craig Willers. So Craig is saying, thanks, Peter. Nice talk as always. Part of attracting and improving use is high quality and high quantity data and samples, not cheap. A living international business case seems important here. What about establishing an international biobank impact registry, which all biobanks can maintain, their publications and direct and indirect connections of resources to changes in policy and practice. So I guess, yeah, moving to that international level.
Well, just a comment back. Thanks very much, Craig, for those thoughts and comments, and agree with a lot of it. Great ideas. And you've also read a little bit of my mind, is that I've also been advocating a little bit over the last couple of years that some of our locators, actually what we should be listing is not biospecimens for current research, but we should be using them partly as tools to post cohorts of specimens so that people can see that we're about to discard them. So they could be a tool or a position that we could have international review and debate about whether to discard a cohort of biospecimens or whether to keep them. So I think trying to elevate the decision process around some types of collections, large and previously valuable, I think that would be a very useful approach.
I'll move to the next question from Jeff Delaney. Thanks very much for your talk. What are the ethical considerations about destroying specimens that have been donated in good faith from patients who were keen for their specimens to be used for research?
I think that's a huge question. I think it's a dilemma for health research. I don't think I've ever seen a biobanking consent form that explained to a patient that actually their donation would be stored for a long time, but it might never be used. It might never be used, not because it's not a good specimen, it's just that there are different selection criteria in research. And so it might live in the biobank for 10 years, and then we might want to discard it. And that doesn't belittle or reduce the value of that donation, because we're only able to select if we have a large inventory. So, but I don't think we explain that to the public, and we certainly don't explain it to the donating public. And so I think we're kind of stuck with the fact that we haven't been transparent about this, but I think it's now an issue, and we need some guidance and route out of it, because we can't go on swelling inventories in health research institutes. But great question.
Thanks, Peter. Yep, I actually skipped a question from Kevin Spring. So Kevin's question is about clinical data linkage. Can you comment on its value, and if you know how well clinically annotated biobanks tend to be, and also can the cost of biobanking with data linkage software be sustained, and is automated near real-time data extraction important? So a few questions there.
There's a lot to unpack in that question around data and biobanks. I think there's no question in my mind that the value of biobanks going forward depend on the way we link them to data and how data and what data is linked to them. But I think there's a lot of things to think about. There's real-time data, linkage to real-time clinical data to a biobank doesn't help you very much if you can't understand the variance and the changes in clinical data. To take cancer just as an example, when the biobank collects the specimen, it might be called diagnosis 1. But a year later, the disease evolves, somebody else looks at it, you say, actually, it isn't disease 1, it's disease 1B. We've also gradually going on classifying and analyzing material and diagnoses so that we're actually, so the real-time clinical data sometimes becomes out of date. And so it's very hard to then have that overwrite a biobank database. And it's hard for researchers to understand what's going on. So I think I'm just giving one example in my mind of the complexity of trying to do real-time linkage of clinical data with biobank inventories. But there's no question that biobanks have kind of grown up in isolation from data registries, and we really need to more effectively and collaboratively link these in the research space.
Thank you. I'll move to a question from Jane Carpenter. So Jane's asking, when assessing against a comparative collection, is this a good opportunity to merge into a larger, potentially joint collection? Is that another option?
Yeah, that's a very good thought and a good point. It's also an opportunity not necessarily to destroy a whole collection, but you might say, well, for the next 5 years, we'll store half the number of vials rather than all the vials that we've got. So you can trim and cull portions of the biospecimen associated with a cohort without actually losing the ability to offer that cohort. I think one of our traps is we keep storing all those vials and all those blocks. And but going back to your question, it would also, the process, if we actually tried to do it more systematically, would allow us to say, well, if we've got 10 triple negative breast cancers in this biobank, and there's 90 triple negatives in the biobank down the road, why don't we trim out all the ones we don't need? And then when a researcher comes, the two biobanks could service that research request from smaller stocks in each biobank, rather than both biobanks holding 100 triple negative breast cancers to service one research request. So in that sense, a virtual combination of different cohorts might be a very valuable way for us to trim individual inventories.
And a question from Amanda Rush, wondering if you could comment on furthering collaborations with industry and whether you predict that this would or could change the balances of specimens stored versus used.
Well, I think I need a little bit more detail on the question, but the question has reminded me to make the point that obviously in this whole talk and all the math and data that I put forward, I don't include industry research, which is really important. It's very valuable. It generates data, but a lot of it isn't reflected in the published data. But I think also industry is beginning to amass virtual biobanks and secondary biobanks, but a lot of the primary biobanks of frozen biospecimens, in my mind, but I stand to be corrected, in my mind, it's mostly academic health research biobanks that hold most of those stocks. And industry has kind of moved on more rapidly to create new secondary biobanks or virtual biobanks based on paraffin blocks or fresh biospecimens obtained in the course of prospective clinical trials. So I think their footprint in this inventory space is a little smaller, I would say, than the academic sector. But I could be wrong there. That's just, I'm half making that up.
Look, I think I'm watching the time, but I think we've got time for a last question from Craig Willers, which is just about the term biobank. Should we be changing this to something else? I know this is something that we've thought about in before.
I think many of us have talked about this. I think Dan Catchpole put together a very interesting expert speak on this in Bio a year or so ago. I think it's a subject a lot of us think about. I personally have written and would love to try and find a way to drop the word bank, because I think the connotations with financial banks and the connotations with we just put stuff in inventories and you can get it if you twist our arm. It's all wrong and it doesn't fit the modern operations and the position that I think biobanks can contribute to health research by contributing their expertise and services more than our stocks. So I'd love to try and drop the term, but I think it may be with us to stay.
I think that's a great place probably to finish. But Peter, that was a very, very thought-provoking talk. I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Thank you to everybody who joined us, and look forward to having you with us for our next talk, which is I think on the 14th of September, when we'll be having Andrew Gilbert joining us from Bioplatforms Australia. But thank you very much, Peter. Wonderful to see you again.
Jenny, and thanks
thank
all
you.
for listening.